Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for tonight's program, Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern, with author Charles Dellheim. Before we get started, a few things to note. Your audio and your video will be off throughout. You may send us your questions via the question panel at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short and please refrain from comments if you can so that we can try to get to all of the questions this evening. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's presenter, Charles Dellheim. Charles is a professor of history and Jewish studies at Boston University. He grew up in New York City and earned his doctorate in modern European cultural history at Yale. His most recent book is Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern, blending Jewish history, art history, and European history. This book turns the story of Nazi stolen art on its head by focusing on how, against all odds, certain Jews became key players in the market for both old masters and for modern art. Belonging and Betrayal was named one of the best books of the year by the Times Literary Supplement London, Kirkus Review, and ArtNet. Charles has also written widely on topics from architecture to company culture to baseball. His previous books include The Face of the Past, The Preservation of the Medieval Inheritance in Victorian England, and The Disenchanted Isle, Mrs. Thatcher's Capitalist Revolution. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much. Am I visible yet?
No, we're going to make you visible. The modern
You
technology. We can't see you, but we can hear you. There you are. Welcome. I'll turn it all over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Lisa for the very kind introduction, and to Lisa and Elizabeth for the forbearance with my own well-earned reputation for technological incompetence. It's a wonderful honor to be here today at the Yiddish Book Center, though I am, like most of you, far removed, sitting outside of Boston. And I want to thank everyone for coming, and I look forward to your questions. When Lisa mentioned dates to me, I naturally gravitated to February 2nd, not because I have an unnatural or pronounced interest in the groundhog, but because it's my mother's birthday. And my mother was born 100 years ago in Brooklyn and passed away many years ago. And I certainly would not have been a scholar or gone to university, let alone graduate school, without the encouragement of both my parents, who venerated learning and education. And one of the many reasons that I admire the Yiddish Book Center is because it has preserved Jewish learning and extended it, and found innovative ways to keep it alive. First slide, please. One day in 1912, Leonce Rosenberg, who was an art dealer's son and a connoisseur in his own right, went for a walk along Rue Vignon. Rue Vignon is near the great church of the Madeleine. Next slide, please. He happened into a small street, Rue Vignon, as I mentioned, and in the window of this unprepossessing little gallery, he saw a picture that interested him. It was the work of Dutch emigre artist Kees van Dongen. Although Leonce was an habitué of the Paris art world, he had never heard of the proprietor. The young man, who was only a few years his junior, was a German Jewish emigre named Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, who we see here in a stunning Van Dongen portrait. Next slide, please. And the next. An incredibly arresting picture. What Leonce saw in Kahnweiler's little gallery literally changed his life. He encountered a remarkable array of Cubist art, presumably including works by Picasso, Braque, Grise, Leger, and many others. These were works that most connoisseurs and collectors turned away baffled, shocked, enraged. They found incomprehensible. Not so Rosenberg. By the time he comes to Rue Vignon, his personal collection includes the works of Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Matisse, the Douanier, Rousseau. And he immediately embraces the Cubist commitment to aesthetic experimentation and their rejection of traditional forms of representation. More to the point, though, for us, he began buying their work with an enthusiasm that bordered on the reckless. This little scene at the Rue Vignon may introduce us to the story I want to tell today. How certain Jews, against all odds, came to play leading roles in the triumph of modern art. Now, what makes this particularly interesting is that, as we all know, Jews were the proverbial people of the book. They were traditionally on the margins of European high culture. Visual art, by contrast, was at its symbolic core, the province of monarchs, of churchmen, and of nobles. The entry of Jews into the art world was made possible mainly by three major historical transformations. First, the gradual opening of high culture, its movement from royal courts to metropolitan centers. Second, the political and legal emancipation of Jews provided new opportunities for cultural integration. Finally, the refusal of the entrenched powers, the Academy of Fine Arts and the Salon in Paris, to accommodate new forms of aesthetic expression, the so-called painting of modern life, provided openings for new players. But what enabled Jews to take advantage of these openings was two things. On the one hand, their economic culture. On the other hand, their cultural ambitions. And to put it simply, business became an avenue to cultural aspiration and to cultural integration. Now, what's interesting about modern art is that, like many of the endeavors in which Jews participated and clustered, it was a rapidly expanding business. It had relatively low barriers to entry. It provided scope for international trade, opportunities for ethnic networks. Competition was limited. Startup costs were modest, and discriminatory barriers were comparatively low because professional hierarchies had not yet consolidated. Moreover, timing mattered. The migration of Jews to leading urban centers, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and many others in the late 19th and early 20th centuries coincided with the birth of the modern movement in these metropolitan centers. Finally, the virtual exclusion of Jews from dominant artistic institutions meant they had less reason to defend an order that they had no stake in. As a result, they were, by and large, though not universally, more receptive to modernist art than those who benefited directly from the status quo. There's one more thing, though, that is crucial. Modern art offered Jews a means to define a secular identity. The avant-garde in its different phases was, among other things, a social community. Religious faith, ethnic origins mattered much less than commitment to new forms of expression and experimentation. This was good news for Jews who could not take social acceptance or respectability for granted. With this backdrop in mind, let's take a closer look at the young man we see here, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler. He was born in 1891 in the Rhineland city of Mannheim, about 10 miles from where my father's family lived for centuries. He was born into a well-to-do and rather conventional bourgeois Jewish family. His parents, he complained, evidently had few books or pictures in their home. Young Kahnweiler was intellectually gifted, intellectually curious, but he had little idea how to translate his interests into a career. So after completing his studies at the Oberrealschule, he did not go to university. Why not? Mainly because his family expected him to devote himself to business. Now, Kahnweiler was inwardly rebellious, but outwardly compliant. And he reluctantly followed suit. He did not protest his parents' plans. They stuck him, as he put it, in a bank in Germany. But then he had a stroke of luck. They sent him off to Paris, where he was to train as a stockbroker. Next slide, please. It was in Paris that Kahnweiler's discovery of art began. He regularly appeared as expected in the offices at the Boulevard Haussmann, which we see here in 1910 at a rare moment when the Seine flooded. He appeared too at the Bourse, the stock exchange. Whenever possible, though, he ducked out and immersed himself in Paris's great museums, above all the Louvre, and he began reading art history. He was entirely self-taught. Next slide, please. One day, in a little room at the beautiful Luxembourg Gallery on the left bank, he came upon an extraordinary collection of Impressionist paintings, the like of which he had never seen before. Next slide, please. They'd been acquired by one of the Impressionist group, Gustave Caillebotte, whose great painting, Paris Street, Rainy Day, we see before us. Caillebotte, unlike many of his fellows, came from a family with considerable private means, and he generously used his fortune to patronize his compatriots' work. When Kahnweiler saw the assortment of works by Manet, Monet, Degas, and Pissarro, next slide, please, he was baffled. This proves, he later observed, that the comprehension and even the reading of a new kind of painting is difficult for everyone. It was a lesson. Newfound obsessions did not release him from family expectations or commercial obligations. As expected, he went to London to work for his uncles, the Neumanns. They were wealthy financiers and traders who had made it into the top rungs of English society, however insecurely. Meanwhile, he continued his aesthetic education in the National Gallery and beyond, while learning the intricacies of a family business that spanned much of the globe. Kahnweiler was bored by his work, but he did it well enough to satisfy his uncles, who were certainly meticulous and picky by any standard. They decided he had nothing more to learn in London, and they told him that they were going to send him to their office in Johannesburg, in booming South Africa. This was where he held the line. Out of the blue, he told his astonished uncles, the Neumanns, he wanted to be an art dealer. Now, his uncles, who collected works by Reynolds and Gainsborough that their nephew despised, sensibly asked, "But do you know anything about it?" "Yes," he said. He wanted to represent the artists of his own generation, the likes of Vuillard and Bonnard. Open-minded but skeptical, the Neumanns decided to send their headstrong nephew see their own art dealer and fellow German Jewish emigre, Asher Wertheimer. Next slide, please. Who we see in a magnificent portrait, and a controversial one by John Singer Sargent. And at the Neumann's request, Asher Wertheimer gave Kahnweiler a little test. And if the test had been fairly graded, the young man probably would have flung. But Wertheimer had no motive to stand in the young man's way, and certainly no motive to displease his uncles, and he gave him a good report. Hence, the Neumanns made their nephew, an offer he could not refuse. We will help you fund your Paris gallery. If after a year, however, you have not made it pay for itself, you will return to the family business without complaint. Next slide, please. In 1907, then, Kahnweiler returned to the city of his dreams. He opened his gallery on Rue Vignon in humble premises that had been recently vacated by a poor Polish tailor who had been dispossessed. For all of his newfound knowledge of art, though, he knew virtually nothing about the workings of the art market, what to buy or where to buy it. The paintings he wanted to buy, Cézanne's for instance, were well beyond his financial reach. So he began scouring what was then called the Black Salon. These were the independent salons outside the circle of the Academy. And in these Black Salons, he saw the work of emerging artists. Also, he came to know émigrés. Paris, then as now to some extent, was a magnet for émigrés, would-be artists and intellectuals from different parts of the world. And one of the most interesting, indeed captivating them, was this man, Willy Ude, who we see here. Willy, who was a German and not a Jew, who had studied law and had given it up in favor of art history, had moved to Paris and used family resources to live in. He started out on his own, and he frequented the Café du Dôme. Next slide, please. Which was a center for émigrés, and so popular by the turn of the 20th century that the proprietor had the fortunate question facing him of how to find more space, which he soon did. Willy became right away, and Willy told Kahnweiler about a young painter who lived in Montmartre and who was doing something remarkable. Next slide, please. Montmartre, as you may know, is a hilly and the northern point in Paris, the northernmost point in Paris. It was a raucous, rough and tumble working class district, which became a bohemian haunt. Its denizens were mattress makers, mill workers, fishmongers, cabaret performers, actors, singers, dancers, musicians, prostitutes, and not least artists. In a ramshackle building known as the Bateau Lavoie, next slide, please. Kahnweiler met the artist who would become the great star of the avant-garde, Pablo Picasso. Next slide, please. Who we see here in Montmartre as a very young man, a couple of years after he has arrived in Paris, hopeful and aspiring, but not yet successful. Kahnweiler enters this ramshackle building. It's falling apart. The plaster's coming off the walls. The stairs seem so shaky that a less determined person would not have navigated them. And he comes down to Picasso's studio. And he sees a young man with very intense eyes and a large head who comes to the door with shirt off and lets Kahnweiler in. And in the middle of the room was a revolutionary painting, which is now known as the Demoiselle d'Avignon, and which hangs in the Museum of Modern Art. At the time, though, it was called the Philosophical Brothel. Next slide, please. Now, Kahnweiler did not claim that he understood what Picasso was up to, but he did understand the aesthetic importance of what he saw before him, a remarkable new way of constructing space. He offered to buy the painting. He virtually begged Picasso to buy the painting, but Picasso said it was not finished and it was not on offer. Nevertheless, in the heady days before 1914, Kahnweiler gradually became the dealer for the Cubists, for Picasso, for Gris, for Braque, for Léger, and for many others. And despite his avowed distaste for finance, Kahnweiler, who was nothing if not orderly, systematic, and cerebral, had learned a great deal about how art markets operate in his time working for his uncles. And he hit upon a way of supporting the artists by providing them with a modest stipend for their work. And in return, they would give him right of first refusal. And in this manner, he established a virtual lock on the Cubist work well before it began to take off, either in terms of critical esteem, let alone commercial value. Next slide, please. What would become of us, Picasso once asked, if Kahnweiler hadn't had a business sense? So how did Kahnweiler pull this off? Kahnweiler was a bourgeois malgré lui. He was a bourgeois quite in spite of himself. Or to be a bit more precise about it, he straddled the bohemian and bourgeois worlds. And this comes to the fore in Picasso's 1910 portrait of Kahnweiler. And this portrait, like other portraits that Picasso painted of would-be patrons, either dealers or collectors, was a symbol of a complicated bond between patron and artist. What do we see in the dissolving forms? We see a seated businessman with assorted body parts, a high-collared white shirt, combed hair, the twin arcs of a watch fob. But we also see something which indicates Kahnweiler's passion for the avant-garde and his links with Picasso and the Cubists, the African masks, which played so important a role in the genesis of Cubism. So on the one hand, Picasso is making fun of him, this bourgeois businessman with all of these conventional symbols. But on the other hand, he is saluting Kahnweiler for his advanced taste. And he turns Kahnweiler into something of a modernist icon. Next slide, please. And the next. The divide between business and social life, between what was personal and what was professional, really didn't exist for Picasso and his artists beyond a certain point. Kahnweiler accompanied Picasso and the rest of the crew to their favorite haunts. he watched them live a much more instinctually gratifying, visceral kind of life than he himself was comfortable with. He was buttoned up. He was restrained. And he would always go home to his comfortable bourgeois surroundings in the beautiful 16th arrondissement. In other words, Bohemia was a nice place to visit, but he didn't want to live there. Next slide, please. Now, as an emigre in Paris, Kahnweiler had certain disadvantages. He could not count on a built-in social network. He did not have a group of Parisians of the bourgeoisie, let alone the upper class, who were going to help him get started. So what he does very cleverly is he turns eastward, as John Richardson put it. And this Eastern strategy means looking to Germany. And what Kahnweiler did in the years before the Great War, and to some extent thereafter, was to forge bonds with other German Jewish collectors and dealers. And none was more important to him or more gifted than the young man we see here, Alfred Flechtheim. Flechtheim was the man that Kahnweiler came to regard most highly. He believed that when it came to art, if Flechtheim was not able to pull off something extraordinary, no one could. In social background, commercial experience, aesthetic interests, they had much in common, both from bourgeois Jewish families of a fairly conventional sort. In temperament, though, the two men were polar opposites. Kahnweiler was cerebral, disciplined, restrained, buttoned up. By contrast, Flechtheim was an imposing figure. He was rarely seen without a cigar in his hand or his mouth. He was passionate. He was gregarious. He was expansive, so much so that it seemed sometimes that he was going to burst at the seams. Who was this young man? Where did he come from? He was born in 1878 to a family of German Jewish grain dealers, one of the agricultural middlemen businesses in which many Jews, my own family among them, clustered. Unlike Kahnweiler, though, Flechtheim eagerly entered the family business. He admired its high ideas, its ethical reputation, and he wanted nothing more than follow in the footsteps of his father and his uncles. Even so, he found the day-to-day routines of grain dealing unsatisfying, indeed stultifying. It had only one saving grace for him, apart from family obligation. That was the opportunity to travel widely and frequently in business. In Paris in 1907, Alfred Flechtheim fell in love with modern art. Like Kahnweiler, he comes to the Café du Dôme. He becomes a fixture in émigré circles. Willy Ude introduces Flechtheim to Kahnweiler. In turn, Kahnweiler introduces Flechtheim to Picasso. And Picasso was utterly charmed by Alfred Flechtheim, who was gregarious, who was outgoing, who was warm, who had a great eye for art, and to boot was fluent in Spanish. This did not release Flechtheim, however, from the routines of grain dealing. But he had one great advantage. He had a bountiful dowry from his understanding wife, Betty. And Betty came from a well-to-do Jewish family. And with her permission, he used part of the dowry to begin buying art. And he bought extremely well. Within a number of years, he had the finest treasure trove of Picassos in Germany, along with beautiful pictures by Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh, Seurat, Rousseau, and Munch. This pattern of buying modern art, however, did not sit well, to say the least, with his in-laws, the Goldschmidts. They had no way of knowing, however, that what their son-in-law was buying would one day be worth more than any investment they could have made at the time. Meanwhile, the grain business, through no fault of Fleshtheim's, began to stall. It always had vicissitudes. There were always ups and downs, and problems mounted. And he found himself in the difficult position of trying to revive the fortunes of a flagging family business. And then he began to make unwise investments as a way of building up the business. He invested in mines. The mines went bankrupt. This only made things worse. Desperate to avoid bankruptcy, which was the ultimate disgrace for an honorable merchant, he decided to take drastic action. He contemplated suicide in the hope that his insurance would keep the business afloat when he went under. Fortunately, with the help of generous friends, he managed to navigate the problems ahead and salvage the family business. Despite these travails, though, all the while, he single-handedly carried on buying art. But this was more than an individual enterprise. He was responsible for revitalizing the Sonderbund, the local association of artists in his hometown of Düsseldorf. He organized a triumphant exhibit of modern art in Cologne, and he played a major role in shaping the first Picasso retrospective at the gallery of another Kahnweiler ally, the Tannhäusers. In 1913, Fleshtheim had finally put the family business on a sure enough footing that he could leave it to others. And he was free at last to open his own gallery. And so he did. The gallery did very well at first, but his timing could not have been less fortunate. On August the 5th, 1914, he wrote in his diary, "Everything is finished." In fact, Fleshtheim served Germany with distinction during the Great War. He rose to the rank of officer, no mean feat for a Jew. But while his war record was admirable, his fledgling gallery went under through lack of care and through lack of business. Kahnweiler found himself, meanwhile, in a very complicated position. Kahnweiler was a cosmopolitan. He was a pacifist. He was a socialist. He was a man of the left. But more to the point, he did not want to fight for or against Germany, for or against France. So very reluctantly, after weeks of hesitation, he decided to accept the invitation of an old friend from his Paris days and sit out the war in Switzerland. And it was in Switzerland, where he was sidelined from doing business, that he wrote the first major treatise about the rise of Cubism. Now, during the 1920s and 30s, certain Jews found new prominence in the art world as dealers, as collectors, as critics, as connoisseurs, and not least as artists. What about Alfred Fleshtheim? Let me tell you his story briefly. In the wake of Germany's defeat, he found himself without a gallery, but he still had a vocation. And after the war, he came roaring back with backing again from friends. He established a little modernist empire of his own. He opened galleries in Düsseldorf, in Frankfurt, in Cologne, in Berlin. and he had a share in a wonderful Viennese gallery. In December 1923, he and Betty moved to Berlin, which was the hub of the new Weimar Republic. It was also the hub of cultural experimentation. And Flestheim showed amazing work in his gallery. Picasso, Matisse, Munch, Kandinsky, Gross, Ernst, Beckmann, Kokoschka, and Klee, among many others. At the time, he also gave parties that were so wild and so raucous that even by Weimar standards, they became legendary. In short, Alfred Flestheim epitomized the creative spirit of innovation and experimentation of Weimar. He became what my teacher Peter Gay called the outsider as insider. But visibility bred vulnerability. Success came at a cost. The incursion of Jews into cultural ground previously dominated by non-Jews became a pretext for a furious anti-Semitic backlash. This backlash culminated, next slide please, in a Nazi culture war again, and the next slide please. There we go. A Nazi cultural war against the Jews. And Alfred Flestheim became a symbol of the Nazi hatred of modern art. As you probably know, Nazis considered modernism a degenerate art, entartete Kunst, and they condemned modern art along with the supposedly Jewish sciences of relativity theory and psychoanalysis. Modern art was racially impure. It was a threat to the culture of the German people. It had to be rooted out. It had to be destroyed. In 1933, in March, 3 weeks before the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses was about to begin, under the aegis of the Nazis, all over Germany, a group of Nazi thugs bombed an exhibition that Alfred Flestheim and a few friends had put together at an auction house in Düsseldorf. No one was hurt, nothing was destroyed, but it was not for lack of trying. Flestheim's friends fled almost immediately. He did not. It took him about a year to find the means to leave Germany. He did not want to leave. He did not want to leave his wife, Betty, behind. He certainly did not want to leave his gallery behind. But by then, he was in trouble, and he knew it. He just did not know where the trouble would end. Fortunately for him, with the help of his deputy for escape, Christoph Bernoulli, he is able to leave Berlin and ultimately make his way through Switzerland and France to England. And there he eventually is able to take part in shaping exhibitions and to some extent in selling modernist art. He struggles, however, to make a living. What happens to his collection? What happened to his collection prefigured what happened to a massive number of Jewish-owned collections in the late 1930s and still more in the 1940s. It was dispossessed by the Nazis. It was simply taken over. Alfred Flestheim dies in March 1937, a relatively young man, not yet 60, I believe. And he had lost a great deal. The exile had taken a physical toll on him, an emotional toll on him. He did not live to see the degenerate art exhibit, which repudiated and excoriated everything he had worked for. He did not see the massive confiscation of Jewish-owned collections by the Nazis, whose impact we are still working with today. But his tale like the tale of other Jewish art dealers and collectors, is not simply a saga of betrayal. It is also a saga of the quest for belonging. Thanks very much. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Charles. I was a little slow because I was totally engrossed. Wonderful lecture. And let's see what we've got for questions here. I'll get started. Do you think art was a means to assimilation?
Well, assimilation is a very tricky word, as we all know. The question, when you hear the word assimilate, my question is, assimilate what? Assimilate into what? I think it's more precise to say that art was a means of acculturation. It was a means of acquiring emblems of national citizenship, emblems of cosmopolitan sympathies. But if what we mean by assimilation is that this is a choice between art collecting and any kind of Jewish ties, that is not the way things happened. I mean, excuse me, most of the people that I wrote about were secular Jews. But secular Jews were, for a variety of reasons, by their own choice and by the persistence of anti-Semitism, people who tended to gravitate to Jewish circles, both socially and professionally.
Many of these dealers were painted by the artists they represented. Why do you think so?
Well, I think there's an interesting genre of I think it's about 50 paintings or so I found, maybe 60, of modernist artists painting their Jewish dealers and collectors. Well, one reason is that a way of consolidating a bond between a dealer and a collector, or a collector and an artist, was to commission a portrait. The artists needed money. They needed to be able to show their work. And in the case of Picasso, but many others, the process of sitting for a portrait was very intimate. And this was a kind of, I don't want to call it a bullfight, but it was certainly some kind of social ritual in which two men who were both very stubborn, very obdurate, very concerned, very certain of their own gifts and aptitudes, were circling each other and trying to get to know each other. I think that there's also a very close, real admiration between the artists and the dealers. Look, artists complain about dealers in the way that writers complain about publishers, musicians about impresarios. As one word, the Yiddish word that I teach my students first is kvetch. And they ask me what that means, and I tell them, that's what you're doing now. And the ties between artist and dealer are extremely important in understanding these portraits, but so are the conventions of portraiture. Because one thing which is interesting is that before the early 19th century, I think the portrait of Monsieur Dellheim, there were precious few important portraits of businessmen. And from the point of view of the dealers, these portraits showed them to be people of taste, people who were committed to the avant-garde. And in that sense, they were worth well more than they paid for them.
Could you elaborate on what makes Sargent's portrait of Asher Wertheimer somewhat controversial?
Well, I mean, personally, I love the portrait. And the real question about the portrait is, well, is this portrait anti-Semitic? And it's a complicated question. The short answer is Asher Wertheimer didn't think so. He hung it in his dining room. He was extremely proud of it. This is the way he saw himself. And Wertheimer who was a dealer in antiques and in fine art, especially old masters. His father was a German Jewish emigre who had come to England as a peddler selling toys, and became a very notable antiques and art dealer, commissioned a series of what ended up being 12 portraits from Sargent. And all of these portraits were hung in the Wertheimer dining room, which was called the Wertheimer mess. Though it wasn't a mess by any of our standards, it was a rather grand and elegant room. What's controversial about it? Well, what you could say is that Asher is painted as a thrusting Jewish businessman, that he has certain features at the time that would have been identified as specifically Jewish. The hooded eyes being one of them, the symbol of the cigar, a man who is bursting out of his door, who is pushing forward in a society in which being seen to push forward was being a bounder. It was not the done thing. You could do it, but you couldn't be seen to be doing it. If you compare the Wertheimer portrait to, say, a portrait of one of the jeunesse dorée of the aristocracy that that Sargent painted, you will see an arrogant young man decked out in white, looking like he owns the world, because he usually does own a good chunk of it. He's pictured against classical columns. He's located in the history of Western art and Western culture in a way that Asher is not. But as I said, Asher himself did not think the portrait was anti-Semitic, nor did his family. But there is a postscript. And the postscript is that Wertheimer ordained that after his death, that all of the portraits would be bequeathed to the National Gallery. And the National Gallery took the gift. But the gift soon became controversial, because an anti-Semitic MP, and he had some company, said, "We do not want these Jews in the National Gallery." This was a place for aristocrats, for royals. This was a place for those who had hereditary titles, for those who had accomplished great things for king and country, and tried to have them removed. And the postscript to the story is that Asher Wertheimer's younger friend, Joseph Duveen, arranged to have a gallery built for the portraits in the Tate Gallery.
Dellheim was painted a few times by Otto Dix in ways that looked almost caricatural. Did you consider these portraits anti-Semitic, or is this how he looked?
Well, I think that Otto Dix was not a portraitist for the weak-hearted. If you wanted to be prettified or gussied up, if you wanted to be admired or flattered, he was definitely not your man. But I don't know if we can get the portrait up now. The 1926 Alfred Flestheim art dealer. But yes, I think this is definitely a portrait with anti-Semitic signs, which is interesting because Dix was, as far as we know, certainly no rabid anti-Semite. He was a pacifist, a socialist. He was a man of the left. But Flestheim didn't like his art. He had refused to show his work. And Dix, not unsurprisingly, took offense at it. And he paints Alfred Flestheim with a series of signs that were seen as Jewish. The extremely protruding ears and nose, the sallow complexion. He is bent over. He is wearing a suit that is so furry that it almost looks simian. He has a picture in behind him. And what was it? It was almost certainly a French Cubist picture, probably agrees. And that was one of the grievances that Dix had against Flechtheim, that why is he promoting French art rather than German art? In fact, he was doing both. And if you look at the portrait, what is Flechtheim doing? He is looking down at the contract. So there is, to me, a little bit of Shylock's shadow in this portrait.
Do you think Picasso took care of Gertrude Stein's collection because of his exposure to Jews?
Well, Picasso had almost as many dealers as lovers. Not quite. That would have been quite a feat for him. And he went from one Jewish dealer to another. He went from Betrayal to Kahnweiler, from Kahnweiler to Léonce Rosenberg, from Léonce Rosenberg to Paul Rosenberg, and then eventually back to Kahnweiler. He certainly had significant ties within Jewish Paris, and there were links between, bohemians like bohemian emigres like the Little Picasso Band, and with Jews. They are outsiders in the establishment. They are committed to the modern movement. They are dedicated to some kind of aesthetic transformation, but they also want, critical acceptance. They want to succeed commercially. And there's a kind of elective affinity in Max Weber's term between these Jewish businessmen and these avant-garde artists. Gertrude Stein's story is a very complicated one. His relationship with the Steins goes back to early in his time in Paris, and also to Gertrude. He's also close to Leo Stein, to Michael, and to Sarah, and of course to Alice B. Toklas, and to as well as to many of his Jewish dealers. But Gertrude Stein's own conduct during the war was less than admirable. She left Paris with Alice for good reason. No one could blame her. It was a rational thing to do under the circumstances. How would two aged Jewish American lesbians have fared during the Nazi era? Not so well. But she was well disposed to Vichy. She liked Marshal Pétain, and she certainly was not in any sense a resistor, active or passive. And while it's true that Picasso took care of her collection, but one big black mark against Picasso, who I adore, was that Max Jacob, who was a Breton Jew, who had a vision of Mary and converted to Catholicism and became a very, very pious Catholic. When the occupation came, and for all his sincere Catholicism, Max Jacob was in danger. Picasso did not lift a hand to save him, evidently. There are stories to the contrary. It's also true that Picasso did help many people, Jews and non-Jews, during the occupation.
I'm going to put these two questions together. Did the collectors and dealers collect art by women artists? And your examples of artists or male artists, are there any Jewish women artists whose work is included in your research or broader thesis?
Sadly, there are very few. There's Sonia Turk, who is better known as Sonia Deloni, who is a fantastic artist and interesting because, like many members of the École de Paris, the School of Paris, she comes from Russia and Eastern Europe. And that's an extremely important group centered in Montparnasse in the 1920s. And this is a group which at one time or another includes Chagall, Soutine, Minchin, Pascan, and many others. But sadly, women artists, including Jewish women artists, do not play a very big role in the story that I tell. A generation later, 2 generations later, thankfully, that was very different. But one of my very favorite characters was an extraordinary woman named Betrayal. And she came from a lower middle class Parisian Jewish family. She was the girl in the family and received precious little education and little encouragement. And she begins working in an antiques business. And the antiques business is in Montmartre. And she was very lively and curious and bright. And she became interested in modern art. And around the time the century turned, she took the extremely bold move of opening her own gallery. And so she has 3 strikes against her. She's a woman, she's a Jew, she's a modernist. But she had a spectacular eye. Dufy called her the marvel. At one time or another, she showed Picasso, Matisse, Modigliani, all of the greats. Unfortunately, her business sense was not on the same level as her taste, nor was her treasury. She went from sale to sale and could not afford to hang on to paintings long enough to build the reputation of the artist and their value.
What about Jewish artists such as Soutine and Modigliani? Were their works handled by Jewish dealers?
Well, at one time or another, yes. And they were handled by different people. One of the people who becomes very important to Modigliani is Paul Guillaume, not Jewish, but who starts off his career as a bellhop, if you can believe it. And there's an extraordinary story there, which I'm afraid I don't have time to tell. But both Modigliani and Soutine are also shown by Zabrowski, who is a Polish Jew, who is very interested in a renaissance of Jewish culture. There are other figures I write about, Abraham Minchin, who were represented for a time by René Jampel, who is one of the major figures in the book. But this is really a matter of timing to an extent. And the key thing to remember about these artists is ethnicity was a bond. But what they needed was to survive and to prevail. So when they had the backing of a dealer who they thought would bring to bear their influence on their behalfs, that's more often than not the dealer they went with. This was not generally a question of sentiment. Well, to be fair, sentiment enters into it, but that wasn't enough.
I think we have time for one more question. The number of questions here is just incredible. We could have a long dinner party with you.
I'm willing to go if you are.
Okay, great. I'd like to hear more about the role place and geography play. To what extent is this a story about Jews in Western Europe or even just in Paris?
Oh, it is certainly not just a Paris-centered story. Look, Paris was, as Walter Benjamin famously wrote, the capital of modern culture. Paris became a magnet, as I said, for would-be artists and intellectuals from the Americas, from Russia and Eastern Europe, from Germany. But this is a story we also see in Germany, in Berlin, in Munich, in Düsseldorf. You see it in London, you see it in Vienna, and I can certainly give you many examples of each. And about one half of my book, about a half, is dedicated to the very important and I think compelling story of the old master dealers. The Wildensteins, the Duvines, and these are people who engineer transatlantic partnerships. So this is a story very much about the Americas, especially when it comes to old master paintings. In the late 19th and early 20th century, American collectors wanted trophies of the European aristocracy, but they were also deeply and sincerely interested in understanding art, and none more so than another of my favorites, Benjamin Altman, whose magnificent collection is still to be found in the Metropolitan Museum. So yes, is Paris important? Indubitably, inevitably. Is Paris everything? Absolutely not.
Just a note that came in, Bertha Weil is about to have a major retrospective show about her work as a Jewish gallerist at the Gray Art Gallery at NYU. And apparently the catalog is fabulous. Share that.
This is the work of Marianne Lemoravan, and she's great and very helpful to me in providing pictures, and wrote a short, wonderful book about the dealer and her amazing and often quite sad and disappointing life. So by all means, everyone go to the exhibit if you're anywhere near it. I'm going to.
Maybe this will be the last one. What happened to Kahnweiler?
Well, Kahnweiler's story is complicated. He goes off to Switzerland, does it so very reluctantly. This is a man who's made Paris France's adopted homeland. He just doesn't, he thinks the war is crazy. He was right, the war was crazy. And what happens to him is that he is classified as an enemy alien. His entire collection is sequestered by the French state. After the war, it takes a couple of years and a few treaties for him to return to Paris, but return to Paris he does. And he slowly rebuilds relationships with his artists. And the one artist who he cannot convince to come back is Picasso, who believed that Kahnweiler betrayed them by leaving them in the lurch. Not being able to support them, not being able to champion them, a very understandable kind of reaction. So Kahnweiler, with the help of a silent partner, André Simon, a banker and a collector himself, starts another gallery, and he has to live with the fact that the French state sells off all of his collection without any recompense to himself or his artists, and to start again. But he does start again. And he starts again, he rebuilds the gallery, he does well for himself, he's universally respected, if not always liked, becomes a fixture in the Paris art world. But then the occupation comes. And with the occupation, Kahnweiler leaves Paris. And so having been victimized, if you will, by the French as a German, he is now seen by the Germans as a Jew and nothing but a Jew. And so he goes into hiding with the help of family and of friends. His hiding place is discovered and he moves again. He survives the war. And after the years after the war, he becomes one of the great mandarins of the French art world, a person who was not only a remarkable dealer, but also a very gifted writer on modern art, on edited works by his artists and their letters, and someone who became important as a theoretician as well. So a happy ending to that story, but not without a lot of heartache along the way.
Charles, a huge thanks for the book, again, belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern. I scooped it up as soon as I saw it, devoured it, and was thrilled that you agreed to come on this evening. So thank you from all of us, myself at the center and the audience. Really, really wonderful. I urge you all to get the book. It's an amazing story, beautifully told. So thank you. And we hope to have you back when you have your next book.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. I want to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli. Tonight's program is part of an ongoing series of programs brought to you, as I like to say, live from the Yiddish Book Center. Please join us Thursday, February 16th for the Sassoons, the Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire. Both that program and tonight's program are part of the Center's Decade of Discovery, Yiddish Around the World. To see the full schedule of events and to register for our programs, please visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Thanks again to our members who make all of our ongoing work possible. Please consider becoming a member or increasing your membership. You may find information about how to donate or join at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Thanks again, and look forward to welcoming you back on February 16th. Until then, stay well.